Welcome to the Des Moines Storytellers Project. Thank you so much for being here to celebrate a night of live storytelling with us. And thank you to Hoyt Sherman Place, which is hosting us tonight. My name is Sarah LeBlanc, and I'm the Western Suburbs reporter at the Register and your host for the evening. Here at the Storytellers Project, we believe that everyone has a story and everyone can tell that story. Tonight's theme is Voyages, life-changing experiences through travel. We know many Iowans are well-traveled people. Tonight, you'll hear stories about family vacations, once-in-a-lifetime romances, and chances to connect with loved ones across the globe. Whether you're a world traveler or if you haven't left the state, we hope you'll find inspiration to open your heart to the world around you. So please join me in turning off your cell phone and getting lost in these stories. Our first storyteller has been behind the scenes for years. Hoyt Sherman's CEO, Robert Warren, will finally take his turn on the stage to tell us about his big family vacation.
It all sounded perfectly charming at first, sort of like a Norman Rockwell painting, for us to take our first ever family vacation up to a quaint little fishing cottage in Grand Marais, Minnesota, just a stone's throw from Lake Superior and the Canadian border. But in reality, the harrowing ride that began in Friendship, Wisconsin back in 1969 when I was just 6 years old started off with me clinging to the back of the front row bucket seat, dodging sparks and ashes from the Pall Mall unfiltered cigarettes that all the adults were smoking in the front. All the windows were rolled down. It was a hot, hot day. And there I am clenching the chair and clinging my buttocks into the rear seat cushion for fear of sliding backwards onto my grandmother's nub of her amputated leg, which was the small space I was allotted to sit in. It was a rite of passage for my older brothers and I because we never got to travel anywhere with my parents. My dad and mom married very early. My dad was 21. My mom was still in high school. And within 4 years of being married, they had 3 small boys to take care of. My oldest brother, Danny, my middle brother, Randy, and me, the baby, Robbie. Dad was a very, very hard worker, both at his full-time job at the paper mill and on our family farm. And my mom, for the most part, was a stay-at-home mom, although occasionally she would pick up a shift at the Tip Top Tavern for a little extra spending money around county fair time or when we need winter coats and shoes. The rest of the time she was stuck at home with the 3 boys. So when the opportunity was presented to my dad by one of his mill buddies to take his family on a vacation free of charge up to his quaint fishing cottage, we leapt at the opportunity. Of course, soon the news spread to my grandparents, who then had to share it with my Uncle Butch because he still lived at home. So our fun family vacation with just mom and dad and the 3 boys had 3 full-size adults added to the equation. So that was not the least of it. We also had to pack in fishing poles, life jackets, a food cooler, a couple of cases of Schlitz beer, all of our clothes, and Dad had already planned on strapping his 16-foot rowboat on the top of our 1957 Chevy Impala. The adventure was ready to begin. So now you see why I was clutching and clinging. I'd never seen a clown car before, but I can only imagine that the exercise that we had to go through to get everybody and everything in that car had to have looked like a combination of a clown car and a Chinese fire drill. We decided that the 3 adult men should sit in the front row bucket seat because they all knew how to read a map. The problem was we had to fit 5 people in the back seat, and it was only designed for 3. So for safety reasons, Mom and Grandma anchored the back doors, and my brothers and I jockeyed for positions in the center. Fortunately, I was the littlest one, so I got the spot next to Grandmother, who unfortunately, because of a farming accident, was an above-the-knee amputee, so I rode in the void of the nub. while her wooden leg rode comfortably in the trunk. More clinging, more clenching. And I kept my focus straight ahead because I'd never seen what the remainder of that leg looked like with the wooden part missing. And I dared not look down at the ground because it kind of creeped me out that there was still a little matching bobby sock and saddle shoe on the leg that remained intact. Away we went on our big 500-mile adventure down the back roads to take in all of the scenic beauty that Wisconsin had to offer. Our first planned stop was at the halfway point in Hurley, Wisconsin, at a scenic little rustic wayside rest stop for a little bathroom break and a picnic. If you've never experienced a toilet at a rustic wayside bathroom from the 1960s, imagine a culvert slammed into a concrete slab over a hole with a toilet seat welded on the top. This particular version was a little too tall for me, so I had to wait for my mom. She came and picked me up and hoisted me up on my throne, and it was a little better view from up there. But I remember looking down and seeing things growing in places that they shouldn't be growing. So I asked my mom exactly what I was looking at, and she said, "Well, those are just little brown mushrooms." To this day, you could offer me $1 million and I would not be able to eat a single mushroom. Yeah. Back in the car to continue on our way, and in about 10 miles of being on the road again, my dad noticed that there was a stranded vehicle on the side of the road with the hood up and smoke pouring out. And in typical Stanley Warren fashion, he had to stop and help. Dad jumped out quickly and sprung into action, took off his brand new white t-shirt, and smothered the flames that were coming out of the carburetor. The kid was very appreciative and thanked my dad profusely, and then asked him if he could possibly give him a ride to town so he could call for help. Apparently, in all of the excitement of his car being on fire, he neglected to look in our vehicle and see that it was already overloaded with humans. But we obliged anyway, and we squeezed one more person into the clown car. We eventually made it to the cottage, which essentially was a glorified chicken coop with droppings all over the floor and actual chicken wire holding the insulation in place on the walls and the ceiling. 2 small windows to either side of the front door, and a single light bulb hanging in the middle of the room. And the kitchenette was a card table with an electric hot plate on it. Fortunately, there were 2 full-size beds in the back, sort of curtained off, and 2 sets of bunk beds, so there was just enough to accommodate us all. The restroom facility, aka an outhouse, even more rustic than the one by the wayside, was about 100 yards across the field. To our north was the farmer and his lovely wife of 70 years that owned the adjacent property. Well, Otis and his wife came down to greet us and also to warn us not to leave any food out, because apparently the bear population was really prolific due to the fact that 100 yards south of our cottage, there was a landfill, and the bears liked to come out at night and forage for food. Yes. So the next few days were filled with fishing and more fishing and a few late night games of Go Fish. We also fell into a nice pattern of eating breakfast, fishing, and then sleeping to the tune of my grandfather's snoring. One night, the snoring was interrupted abruptly because my 2 older brothers decided to go down to the local creek and catch some crayfish to use as live bait for the next day's fishing outing. They put them in a nice styrofoam cooler and put them outside the door on the stoop. Well, apparently in the middle of the night, one of the bears needed a midnight snack. And he came out and ripped that little styrofoam container apart and enjoyed his snacks on the front step of our cottage. Now, mind you, when I was riding in the car, I was in the enviable position of being able to hear all the colorful conversations that Dad and Grandpa were having in the front seat, as well as the ones that my mom and grandmother were having in the back. Even when my mother whispered to my grandmother, "Oh shit, I think I forgot my birth control." And my grandmother takes a long drag off of her cigarette and repeats the phrase, "Oh shit," while rolling her eyes at my two older brothers that were still fighting over who had more inches of the seat. So it was quite the adventure. On the second to the last day, Otis and his wife came down, and they offered to watch the cabin for us while the boys slept so the adults could go into town and have a beer. For an extra layer of protection, my grandmother was kind enough to leave her wooden leg behind, standing in the doorway of the cabin, knowing full well that neither one of my older brothers would have the nerve to touch it. I can only imagine how charming that must have looked to see my grandfather carrying my grandmother into the local watering hole and setting her down on the bar stool for a beer. We had a lot of fun, fished a lot, did a lot of things, and on the very last day, my dad came out and announced to my brothers and I, since we had been so good on this trip, we were going to get an award. We were going to drive across the border into Canada to the Thunder Bay Pancake and Waffle House and get to experience real maple syrup for the first time ever. I remember the view from the restaurant of Lake Superior. It was just spectacular. And the smell of the food and everything, it was about as much as my little 6-year-old heart could take. I'd never been to a restaurant before. We didn't eat out, so it was a real thrill. And I remember being mesmerized by the fluffy apron that the waitress wore and her little matching fluffy scarf handkerchief in her pocket. And I got to drink some coffee from my grandmother's cup for the first time. It was amazing. It was more than amazing. So finally, we were wrapping up our breakfast at this maple syrup mecca, and my two older brothers peeked around the corner into the bar area of the restaurant, and they noticed that there was a pinball machine, so they begged my dad for a couple of quarters to be able to go and play pinball. Sure enough, he gave them the quarters, and off they went. Within about 3 minutes, they were back at the table showing off the prizes that they had won. Apparently, it wasn't a pinball machine after all, but an old-fashioned pull-knob cigarette machine, which they played perfectly. My dad had to get up and go investigate, and he walked around the corner, and sure enough, he came back and he announced to the table that cigarettes are only 25 cents a pack in Canada. Within seconds, every adult at the table was pulling quarters out of their purses and pockets, throwing them on the table and asking Danny and Randy to go win more prizes. I had to stay back at the table and count. At some point during the counting process, my mother noticed a little red seal on the bottom of the cigarette pack that said, "For sale in Canada only." Would we be able to get them back across the border? The final plot of our adventure was hatched. I was told to get underneath the dinette table while my grandmother unhooked her artificial leg. And one by one, the packs of cigarettes were handed to me, and I shoved them down through the soft opening of the top into the hollow core of her wooden leg. We left the restaurant with full bellies and smiles on our faces. I turned around and I noticed that my grandmother wasn't keeping up with the rest of them. Apparently, all that loot in her hollowed-out leg was weighting her down, and her normal little hip swivel walk wasn't working. So she had to revert to another method, which was more of a drag and pull with her left hand. And as she noticed the waitress looking at her, she just holds up her purse and smiles. We finally get outside the restaurant, and we all burst into hysterical laughter for about 10 minutes. Then it was time to get back in the car and head home. We all got in. Grandpa did his duty, put the leg in the trunk one more time, and away we went. We did get stopped at the Canadian border, and the gentleman asked my dad to get out and open the trunk, which he was more than happy to do, knowing full well that the contraband was concealed perfectly. He pops the trunk, and this ranger with his big brimmed hat takes one look at my grandmother's wooden leg laying across the top of our fishing poles and all of our dirty laundry, and he just shakes his head and says, "Have a safe trip home." So this sort of became a little bit of legend in our family, and we shared this story over and over again many, many times. And you probably wonder why I can remember some of these images so vividly when I was only 6.5 years old. But it's because this was the first time that I sort of felt like an adult part of the family. And although I didn't know it at the time, it would be the one and only vacation with my two brothers, because my adorable baby sister, Susan Joy, entered this world on March 27th of 1970, exactly 9 months after that trip. I guess my mom needed that birth control after all. So it was a little bit of legend in our family. We shared it over and over again, this story, at family reunions and picnics. And each time, somebody that would forget a piece of it would share and help the other one out. And it's even more memorable now because half of the adults that were on that trip are no longer with us. And my older brother, the one that played the cigarette machine so perfectly and taught me how to fish and ride a bike and swim across Friendship Pond, sadly is battling a pretty aggressive form of cancer. I drove up to Friendship for Mother's Day a few weeks ago to see Mom, of course, and to hang out at the family farm, but mostly to check in with Danny and see how he was doing and how things were going. And we shared this story and we laughed our asses off over a can of beer, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with him again and again and again. Thank you.
Next, we have Brenda McGuire, who will tell us about finding love across the world.
As I leaned over the balcony of the SS Universe, somewhere over the sparkling blue South Pacific, I was daydreaming about the excitement and the adventure that lay ahead of me. My destination, the world. You see, I was embarking on a 102-day voyage around the globe that would take me to 12 countries on 4 continents. My childhood dream of traveling the world was coming true. Growing up in rural Iowa, surrounded by a sea of cornfields, I was curious what was on the other side of the world, its people, its places, its cultures. But every time I said I wanted to travel the world, people would make fun of me. They'd tease me, except for my parents. They were always my biggest cheerleaders and supporters. And although my dad has passed, I can still hear him saying those 4 magical words to me. Just do it, Brenda. Even though he himself had never been out of the country, he didn't even have a passport. But little did I know that that travel dream would lead me to the love of my life. But first, I would have to go around the world 3 times, and I'd have to travel to 85 countries, and I'd have to move to 6 countries to meet the man that I would marry, while all along he was working in the same building, in the same company, principal, as my mom. So my crazy journey started when I was a senior at Iowa State. One day, I saw a poster that would change my life forever. It read, "Semester at Sea, a floating university." Whoa, I knew that this was for me. So, over the next semester, I was using the world as my classroom, literally. So when we were at sea, we would take classes with other students, about 500 of them. But when we were in the ports of call in these countries, we would go on field trips. Now, keep in mind, my idea of a field trip to this point was going to Chi-Chi's Mexican restaurant for Spanish class. So you can imagine my excitement when these field trips were walks on the Great Wall of China and archaeological digs in Egypt. My favorite part of the whole voyage was meeting so many kind-hearted people around the world and learning about their cultures, their ways of life, what they ate, how they viewed the world, how they communicated. It was so different than my own. I wasn't even off that ship yet, and I was already making plans to live and work around the world. My life would never be the same. Over the next several years, I would end up moving to England, Australia, and Ireland, where I'd even work in a castle. And I then moved to Osaka, Japan for 2 years, and guess what? I saw another poster. It's gonna change my life again. This time it read Peace Boat, a Japanese organization promoting peace around the world. So here I was again, sailing around the world twice more with teaching Japanese students. But my heart kept calling me back to Sydney, Australia for the second time. Honestly, I can't explain it. I just knew I had to go. I didn't know why. I followed my heart. I signed up for a graduate program in international communication, and I moved to Sydney 1 month before the 2000 Sydney Olympics. Now, during the Olympics, one of my friends from Peace Boat came to Sydney. We went out one night, and we met a guy from Malaysia who worked for Principal. Yes, yet again. And through a series of introductions, he introduced me to a guy named Terry. Now, Terry was from Des Moines, worked for Principal in Des Moines, but they had sent him for a 2-year work assignment to Sydney. During the closing ceremony night of the Olympics, Terry had a party at his place. So I went to watch the spectacular fireworks of the Sydney Harbor and the Opera House. I knocked on Terry's door. Little did I know, I was about ready to meet my future husband. But our first meeting was far from perfect. I wasn't feeling very well, and I think the only thing I said to Terry all night was, "Wow, look at those fireworks. They remind me of those at Sec Taylor Stadium." He laughed. Now, you asked Terry, what was your first impression of Brenda? And he'd say, "Wow, she was really quiet." Yeah, right. Little did he know. I still wasn't feeling very well, so I asked Terry for a sweatshirt. Somehow, I fell asleep during this raging party of Aussies. Now, how that happened, I'm not sure. But hours later, one of them went up to Terry and said, "Hey, mate, what happened to that girl?" Terry's like, "I completely forgot all about her." 12 hours later, I woke. We went for breakfast. We found out we had so many things in common: our shared values, our beliefs, our faith in God. We even knew some of the same people back in Iowa. Wow, what a small world. But there was one thing we didn't have in common that really bothered me. You see, Terry is a Hawkeye, and I'm a Cyclone, so you can imagine how disappointed I was. We spent 2 years dating in one of the most romantic cities on earth. We went all around Australia. We went up to the Great Barrier Reef. We took the train across the red outback. But it was 2002, and it was time to pack up. I was graduating, Terry's work assignment was complete. But I was in no hurry to race back to Iowa. In fact, it was really the last place on earth I really wanted to go. Because remember, I spent years trying to escape Iowa. But I thought, here's my dilemma. Do I go back to Iowa with Terry? Or do I continue my jet-setting lifestyle? But I thought, well, why don't I see if Terry will go on this jet-set adventure with me on the way back to Iowa? Plus, I had to test him out. So what did I do? I made Terry put on a backpack. We went to 5 continents in 5 weeks. It was our version of the Amazing Race. We trekked the Himalayas in Nepal. We went on a safari in South Africa. We island hopped in Thailand. We rode this romantic, overpriced gondola in Venice. We arrived back in Iowa. Guess what? Terry passed the test. And I also realized he's a much better traveler than me, but we're not going to tell him that. And definitely more patient. You see, when you travel with somebody like that, you really get to know them. And I knew Terry was a keeper, and I prayed he thought the same of me. But I wasn't ready to settle back in Iowa yet. No. So while Terry moved to Des Moines to work for Principal, I moved to New York to work for the competitor, Prudential. I had the dream job on Park Avenue, but it was far from dreamy. I was miserable. I was miserable in New York City. And I'll never forget, 1 year later, being on my knees in Grand Central Station, crying to come home. I missed Terry, I missed my family, but I was ready to come back to Iowa. Back home, I realized, guess what? I didn't have to give up my travels around the world because I came home. Actually, I could have the best of both worlds. I could work across the world, and I could live in Iowa. I started 2 international companies, Worldwide Connect, which trains global business leaders, and Global Gals, which teaches women to travel the world. I had clients in 40 countries. I was speaking on cruise ships around the world, and I was volunteering my cross-cultural expertise here in our community. 4 years later, of course, we had to go to the next Olympics, this time in Athens, Greece. The day before opening ceremony, we visited the magical island of Santorini. Picture this, the white cliffside village, the setting sun over the Aegean Sea. And Terry, he turned to me, and he quietly got down on one knee. The moment was magical. It took my breath away. Of course, I said yes. We celebrated our engagement the next day at the Olympics in Athens. And 1 year later, we were married on a beach in Maui. Our friends from around the world came to help us celebrate. We felt loved. But I'm proud to say that we've just celebrated 16 years of marriage, and we're still traveling the world. We had planned to go to the Tokyo Olympics, but couldn't due to COVID. But you know what? We still have fun exploring places closer to home. When I was that young girl setting out to see the world, I never dreamt I would have to go around the world and back to meet a boy from Iowa. My life certainly had a funny way of coming full circle. But honestly, it wasn't always very easy. In fact, our journey reminds me of that song, God Bless the Broken Road. I never dreamt that I'd have to travel so many roads, I'd have to cross so many oceans to meet Terry. But I'm glad they brought him to me. I've seen the wonders of the world, but I've also realized that my world, my community, is pretty wonderful too. Terry and I's adventure continues, and I can't wait to see where it takes us next. Thank you.
Our next teller is Akwi Nji, who will share with us what it was like to go back to her roots.
Last summer, I was frantically tossing things into my suitcase in the middle of my bedroom floor. I was unexpectedly homeward bound from Cedar Rapids to Cameroon, Africa, to bury my dad. Dad and I hadn't spoken to each other in over 20 years. Now, there was no catastrophic event that severed our relationship. We just never could seem to see eye to eye. I couldn't meet his expectations, and we were both stubborn. My sophomore year in college, during a phone call, we had a disagreement. We went quiet, and then 20 years quietly went by. I have 7 siblings, and we're spread all over the world. And even though they're close to Dad, none of them knew he'd been sick either. My oldest brother, Gert, he lives in Texas, and he had a sense that maybe something wasn't quite right. So he went to Cameroon to check things out, and when he got there, he discovered Dad was incredibly sick. Within 3 days, Dad was gone. Gert was in shock when he called us siblings in the middle of the night, July 10th last summer, to let us know what had happened and to summon us back home to Cameroon. Now, I lived in Cameroon with Dad until I was about 8 years old, and I had not been back since. I thought off and on through the years about going back, planned off and on through the years, but there were always too many excuses. Not enough money, not enough time off of work, the political climate there was too tumultuous, so many excuses. And yet, suddenly there we were, all scrambling in 2 fast-paced, warp-speed weeks to apply for emergency visas, book flights, prepare for takeoff. I flew Cedar Rapids to Chicago, D.C., Brussels, Yaoundé, Douala. Hours and hours and hours and hours of flight time. Finally, time to think. And I wondered about 3 things. I wondered if anything would be familiar when I got back to Cameroon. I was aching for a sense of familiarity. I wondered if I would recognize family or if they would recognize me. And I wondered if family would welcome me home, even though I'd stopped talking to Dad. When the aircraft landed at the Douala airport, the passengers erupted into applause. I'd forgotten that tradition. In Cameroon, you clap when you land. It's a thank you to the pilot and the crew and to the gods for a safe arrival home. So I was home-ish. I mean, the passengers and I, we all streamed out of the aircraft, but they all looked so comfortable as they were moving through the airport. I was like the limping gazelle all the way in the back of the herd, trying to just get my cues from the other passengers on where to go, what to do, how to navigate through the airport. I mean, they all spoke French. Everything was in French. So no, it didn't feel like a homecoming at all. Nothing smelled familiar, nothing looked familiar, nothing sounded familiar. There was no wave of familiarity that washed over me, okay? I felt like a fish, completely out of water. So I flopped my way through the airport, if you will, following the other passengers through customs and COVID tests, and we were finally making our way to a woman, and she seemed to be collecting what looked like an exit ticket from all the other passengers. It was this small piece of yellow paper, and I started to panic because I didn't know what it was, but I also knew I didn't have one. So I finally arrived in front of her, and I said, "Parlez-vous anglais?" And she rolled her eyes. She shook her head no. I discovered that it was some sort of like proof of yellow fever vaccination. I thought, okay, how do I get through? I've gotten this far. And I said, what can I do? And she shook her head no. She rolled her eyes again, and she held out her hand. She waited. I waited. Silence. Well, I thought, if this is the Cameroon of my childhood, money talks. A handful of cash later, and I was on my way. With that bit of anxiety behind me, I got back to hoping that maybe once I got out of the airport, something would strike a note of familiarity. So I stepped through the sliding glass doors from the airport into the open air, and nothing. It looked like Arizona, smelled like Utah, sounded like every airport parking lot I'd ever been in. But my brother Gert was there waiting for me. We found each other, we hugged, squeezed, stacked my luggage into the back of the Highlander, and off we went on the 6-hour drive from the airport to the family home in Chang. Now, initially, the roads were really smooth, okay? I have to tell you, this was really disappointing for me because I had associated really rough roads with my childhood in Cameroon. Thanks to corrupt government, thanks to French colonization, it meant that historically, the infrastructure is really terrible. So I told Gert this. I'm like, Gert, this is crazy. What's up with these smooth roads? He laughed. He said, just wait. And sure enough, those smooth roads turned into the rough and tumble roadways of my childhood, and suddenly we were MacGyvering our way through the rugged urban landscape. Yes, adventure, no government-maintained roads, terrible municipal infrastructure, symbols of absolute corruption, but also childhood! Woo-hoo-hoo! We arrived at the family home at around 11 p.m., and the anxiety had started to settle in again, but the gates swung open, and even though it was late, women in beautifully patterned dresses streamed out to greet us. There was laughter, rejoicing, arms wide open. They did recognize me, or at least knew I must be Akwi. One woman, she stretched her arms as wide as the ocean between two continents. She pulled me in. She whispered, welcome. You're home. And just like that, open arms, open doors, I was home. I was ushered through the gates that were my father's, through the kitchen that was my father's, into the living room that was my father's. They'd set up an altar for him. There were candles, a Bible. Above the Bible was a framed portrait of him, larger than life, just as he would have wanted. He was smiling. There were the twinkling eyes of my childhood. This was the man everyone loved. Guests poured in from around the country. Family, friends, colleagues of my dad's wanting to express their condolences in person. I met my 3 youngest siblings for my dad's 3rd and final marriage that night. Yeah, prior to that night, I hadn't even seen photos of them. 12 years old, 14, 16. There was sensitive Thede, jokester Mba, Colonel Ngoom. You didn't mess with her. She ran that compound. And there were so many aunties and uncles. We all settled into the living room. Some of them sat in the furniture that lined the living room. Gert was sprawled out on the floor, a glass of wine close by. The rest of us siblings were sort of reclined on the sofas. We shelled and tossed ground nuts into our mouths like popcorn. We laughed and we reminisced and we fell in love with each other. We bonded over card games and funeral planning and karaoke. Mm-hmm. To, of all things, the sound of music. Yeah. Yep, you heard that right. There is video evidence of us do-a-deering our way into the night. all of that. Yep. Yeah. We danced and we sang and we danced until we were spent. There was beer, so much beer, and wine, and laughter and tears. One woman said of my homecoming, "Sometimes things break in order for other things to be fixed." Another woman said, "Amen to that." She snatched a beer bottle from her husband, gripped the cap between her molars, and yanked. Carbonation filled the air, and I was reminded of the Fanta bottles we used to snap open with our teeth as kids. In the following days, I would spend time outside, walking around the property, literally digging in the dirt, looking for remnants of my father's life. Now, the property was huge, and over the decades, it had undergone lots of renovations, and there, you don't really throw anything away, so there were things for me to find. And as I was looking around, I was imagining how my dad's life must have evolved over the years, through the wives, now with these 3 youngest children. Thede, the youngest, 12-year-old, he came out to check on me, and he was curious, asked what I was doing. I said, "Well, I'm looking for remnants and scraps like this." And I held out a handful of rusted nails, caked with the red dirt of Cameroon. And he looked at the pile, he said, "What are you gonna do with that, sis?" I said, "Make art." Oh, you should have seen his face. This is not the kind of thing you do there. So he called his other siblings. He explained to them what I was doing. And Goom, you guys, she laughed so hard. Suddenly, others gathered. There was Helen, Amos, Christian. They all gathered, and then they started exchanging words, first in English, and then French, and then Meta, and then Pidgin English. They couldn't believe that out of all of these languages, it all translated to the same thing. She's looking for trash. You're looking for trash? I'm looking for trash. She's looking for trash. I was looking for trash. What? One man's trash, this woman's treasure. Right, what? They were in disbelief. But pretty soon that disbelief shifted to a desire to help. And then pretty quickly, we were all moving around the property together. We'd get to a spot and they'd say, "This is where we kept the chickens. This is where we kept all the cars. This is where," and someone would tell a story. "That was where," someone would tell another story. "That was when." "This was where." "That was when." And that was how my 3 youngest siblings became the bridge between Dad and me and all the years that had come between us. And I couldn't help but think about the power of words in that moment. How they have the power to pull us apart, but they also have the power to bring us together. Dad and I, we didn't have much in common besides our stubbornness. We did have one thing that we shared, and it was a love for words. So maybe it's ironic that 2 people who loved words chose to stop speaking. But maybe it's also appropriate that it was through the words of these 3 youngest siblings that I found Dad, family, home. Thank you.
Our next teller isn't a stranger to the storyteller stage. Erik Dominguez will tell us a story about how a trip home can teach you about yourself.
Last fall, I was in the planning stages to speak at a conference for a global medical manufacturer when one of the event planners casually mentioned the event's location, Tucson, Arizona. My first reaction was genuine excitement. My family had moved to Tucson from Mexico right after my 8th birthday, and I spent the majority of my childhood and adolescence there. This would be a great opportunity for me to literally come home at the top of my game and to see my dad, who I hadn't seen since the beginning of the pandemic. But frankly, Tucson doesn't have a lot of great memories for me. My early American childhood was filled with anxiety and dread. and had transformed me into an anxious, awkward, unconfident kid. I constantly was looking over my shoulder, terrified to do or say or be anything wrong, because anytime I did or said or was anything wrong, it didn't go well for me. Not only was I constantly picked on, but I had to navigate the journey of being in a foreign city, in a foreign country, primarily alone. You see, the schools near us were not just terrible, but they were dangerous. So my mom and dad, they worked jobs they didn't like, at hours they didn't like, to make enough money to send my brother and I to the top private schools in the area. My school was about 15 miles from where I lived. And in the world of poorly run, poorly scheduled public transportation, it was a crapshoot as to whether or not I would get home in 45 minutes or 4 hours. I would usually get stuck in the transfer station in downtown Tucson, which, there's no polite way to say this, was a dump. Downtown Tucson was dominated by abandoned buildings, pawn shops, questionable restaurants, and so many failing businesses. Well, not all businesses were failing. Some were thriving, but not the ones that you would consider legal in any way, shape, or form. There were many questionable individuals, oftentimes trying to recruit people into their questionable activities. So I walked all around downtown Tucson, a 2.5-mile loop to avoid trouble. And I did it just to keep myself safe, secure, and out of trouble. And when I was of the right age, I kept myself out of trouble by getting my first job ever at the downtown Tucson Holiday Inn. It was not a job I got out of merit, but it was a job that I got as a favor from a family friend. My job was to set up banquet and conference rooms, and I was the youngest one on staff by nearly a decade, felt completely out of place and completely underqualified to be there. And my coworkers reminded of me of that fact every single day. And I don't blame them. I was an easy target and a young man of many contradictions. It was as if this internal rage was raging against the machine, my authentic personality trying to burst out. While I was super, super reserved, I was also incredibly intense, boxed into this persona that I had designed to be invisible, but I was anything but invisible. My rage, my frustration, my anger, all of my emotions exemplified themselves in my identity as a metalhead. I rocked rebellious long hair. I wore dark, oversized flannel shirts, and I ended every conversation with, "Rock on." I don't know why I did that. I think it's because I thought that liking rock and roll would make me seem more American. But I was genuinely addicted to heavy metal and genuinely addicted to my Walkman. I thrashed in the unforgiven lands of Metallica. I sweat bullets in the mosh pits of Megadeth. I used my illusion and danced in the jungles of Guns N' Roses. And I voyaged past the mission, behind the prison tower, in the epically complex, equally rageful world of Tori Amos. Mainly because I had the biggest crush on Tori Amos. Because even though I was incredibly intense, I was also an incredibly hopeless romantic. I could listen to an entire shred metal album and then write a poem to my crush describing in detail how said listening to this album made me think of you and only amplified my feelings for you, my love. My romantic intentions were usually met with immediate rejection and ridicule. In Tucson, I was somehow too much and not enough. Over the top and falling short. Shocking, but forgettable. So my next reaction to the news that I would be speaking there was fear. I genuinely dreaded that being there would bring up too many painful memories that I did not want to revisit or relive. When I arrived in Tucson in March of this year, my first impression was that the town had not changed at all. It was as if somebody had hit the pause button when I left 20 years ago and hit the unpause button when I came back. I delivered my keynote to a great conference, a great event, and I left the event feeling energized but also ready to refresh. I'd booked a small Airbnb in downtown Tucson, more for convenience than for nostalgia's sake. And as I'm driving into downtown Tucson, I see the great Holiday Inn completely abandoned. The whole building was fenced up, and every single window of that building was boarded up. And somehow, it had this weird 1960s pinkish pastel paint job. Somehow, this hotel had only not survived, but had regressed in time. And it was that particular moment when my sneaky, self-sabotaging brain decided it would be a good moment to whisper this thought into existence. Hey, so if Tucson hasn't changed, have you? Aren't you still the same too much and not enough kid you were when you lived here? Isn't this hotel just a reflection of your career and your life? I got settled in my Airbnb and decided to venture out and see how far my brain would take this metaphor. I walked out the front door, turned the corner to the main street, and was instantly discombobulated. I knew where I was. I had walked these streets hundreds of times before, but I had no idea where I was. On the corner, where those questionable individuals would try to recruit you into questionable activities, on that corner was a yoga studio. The bar? You all know the bar. The bar is the bar that every college town has that you only go to if you've lost all hope, dignity, self-respect. That bar was an artesian craft brewery. There were high-end restaurants, bookstores, antique shops, so many different theaters, art galleries, comedy clubs, CrossFit gyms. There were so many thriving legal businesses. The place had completely transformed, and it was a place that was undeniable and in your face. There were building-sized murals everywhere and street art everywhere, individual expressions of communal unity. And it was a place of romance. It was a random Tuesday in the middle of March, but I saw couples of all genders walking hand in hand, leaning in a little closer as they shared a meal and a beverage. it was a place of pride. I walked by a sign that said, "Welcome to the best 23 miles of Mexican food in the United States." Whew! 1, challenge accepted. 2, this sign didn't surprise me. Back in COVID, when everything was shut down, my love and I, we became addicted to the reality television show Top Chef. And a recent season featured a chef who owned Boca Tacos, located in Tucson, Arizona. I had arranged my dad to meet me there. I had not seen him in years, and I wanted to plan something unique and special to him. As a kid, we never went out to restaurants, not just because it was a financial constraint, but because my dad believed that he could make any meal better than any restaurant. And he was right. Anytime we did eat anywhere other than our home, he would take the recipe and make it with significant improvements. But that day at Boca Tacos, he took one bite of his meal, shook his head in disbelief, and said, "I cannot make that." He was so impressed, and I was so proud of where I've come from. Later that evening, I put on my headphones and decided to take the same 2.5-mile walk that I would take as a kid. It was the strangest experience. I spent the majority of my life trying to outrun the version of me that came from Tucson, the one that felt out of place, the one that felt embarrassed by his passions and intensity, the one that felt underqualified for every job I've ever had. But my brain was right. I hadn't changed. The same fears and desires I had there then, I have here now. And that's a really, really good thing. Because it was those qualities that I was trying to outrun that not only make me me, but make me successful at what I do. Because it wasn't lost on me as I walked by the old Holiday Inn that my first job was setting up banquet and conference rooms, and my job now is speaking at said banquet and conference rooms. I spent most of my life trying to change myself, trying to prove myself as a legitimate member of a community and ultimately as a legitimate member of this country. And it took a trip back to Tucson, Arizona to realize change comes best when I don't change anything at all. And I just come home to myself. Thank you, and rock on!
Our final storyteller is Thede, who will tell us a story about taking chances.
So there I was in Paris, the city of my dreams, in the middle of an absolute downpour. I'd gotten on the right train, but off at the wrong stop. My phone was about to die, and the hotel that I had booked for that night and the next 5 had just canceled on me without any explanation. I was sitting in the corner of a fancy French cafe, crying into my cold cappuccino. And it was there that I realized the only French I actually know is from one semester I took way back in 8th grade. The sun was starting to set, I didn't have a place to stay, and this dream that was 16 years in the making was very quickly turning into a nightmare. So I did what I normally do in these situations. I grabbed my journal, and I wrote down May 9th, 2019. Holy shit. like I'm gonna pass out. The sun is setting. I don't have a place to stay. I'm trying to keep it together, but not so much luck. It'll all be okay, question mark. And okay it was, but first it took a lot of long left turns to get right here. You see, I grew up like most of you fine folks in the France of the Midwest, AKA Iowa. I grew up in a small town called Rhinebeck. No stoplights. Go Rebels. My grandparents were just up the alley. All of my cousins and friends were within a few blocks, and it was a sweet and simple place to grow up. I think when I was younger, I honestly thought I was gonna live and die in the zip code of 50669. That wasn't until my family and I moved to the big city of Norwalk, just outside of Des Moines, go Warriors. And it was in Norwalk that I got to see a world I hadn't yet experienced before. Up until that point, travel for me was pretty much family trips. Going up to Minnesota to see my mom's family, down to the Arch, or over to a Broncos game. But it was in Norwalk and in Des Moines that I actually took my first flight from the Des Moines International Airport all the way to Washington, D.C. for the 8th grade trip. Then I went to the University of Northern Iowa. Go Cats! It was at UNI that I studied abroad in Chile. I worked at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, and I even served as an AmeriCorps Vista in Wyoming. But it was that semester in 8th grade that opened my eyes up to a true world outside of one I'd known before. You see, I wanted to take French. My dad thought it was important that I took Spanish, rightfully so, but those classes were full, so French won. And that was the semester I became obsessed with Parisian decor, French cafes, and all things Eiffel Tower. You see, a lot of my life has felt like that journal entry where, on the one hand, I think I might pass out. On the other hand, it's probably gonna all be okay. That was until it wasn't. My dad passed away on February 20th, 2018. Craig Thede was my lifeline and my lighthouse. He was just the best guy. He was the rock that let me roll and the roots that gave me wings. My dad was my compass, my roadmap, and my very best friend. His death was messy and complicated and tragic and sudden in ways I didn't realize death could be. And at just 52 years young, he was gone. At 28, I was planning his funeral, picking out gravestones, and I was miserable and lost and truly struggling to simply exist in a world without him. It didn't just break my world, it shattered my entire ecosystem. It shattered my heart into a million pieces I'm still putting together today. It was a very long winter, a blurry, hazy summer, and then fall rolled around. And I got a text from my friend Shanna, who declared that Pantone was announcing the color of the year, which is a big deal to some people for some reason. You see, Pantone is this thing where they pick a color of the year, and it's all the branding, all the marketing, all the merchandising for the coming year. It's supposed to set the standard, set the stage, and embody all that is to come. The chosen color for 2019, living coral. It was said to be bold, bright, vibrant, energetic, and life-affirming. Sound familiar? I don't know if you know me or not, but I'm kind of a master manifester. I believe in universal winks and numbers and signs, and this was a big one. After a year of loss, I was ready to reaffirm life. So I did what any of you would do in that situation. I booked a ticket to India. My friends and I watched the fireworks on New Year's Eve on my 29th birthday in the city of Jaipur. And I don't know if you've ever been out with me in a night in the East Village. Picture me in India. We ended up meeting a group of fine-looking gentlemen, and let's just say we had our fun. We bar hopped all around the city. We ended up going back home to the DJ's house, where we sang country karaoke songs for 4 hours. And at some point during the night, they even were sweet enough to get me a birthday cake. I don't know where they got it from to this day, but I appreciate it nonetheless. We watched the sun rise, and then I woke up next to the pool without my phone. Happy New Year to me. Being a New Year's baby, I always feel like I have to do something extra special on my birthday, something out of this world, if you will. Wake up somewhere where I don't know where I am. This year was no different. Except for that it was. You see, it was my dad who had instilled this gift of travel, this drive to travel. He saved his whole life and worked so hard his whole life for retirement he never got to see, for a world he never got to experience. Life is just too damn short. But he knew I would get to one day, maybe under different circumstances, maybe not. Either way, he wrote it down in one of my most prized possessions. It's a journal with an Eiffel Tower on the cover and this inscription on the inside. Coral's 21st birthday, January 1st, 2011. Coral, I've often pictured you on one of the many famous French sidewalk cafes, sipping your coffee and scribing in your journal. Ernest Hemingway and Pablo Picasso sat at the quaint tables of Café Le Demeure, and the Café des Fleurs offers an inspiring view of the Eiffel Tower. I can also see you sitting on one of the many park benches that line the Seine River. If you must drive, please take a taxi. Go to the Arc de Triomphe. 12 streets converge here. One day, you will be here. I love you, Coral. Happy birthday, Dad. So I did this because of him, and I did it for me through him. You see, India was kind of a trial run to see if I could do this adventure. And then when I got back home, I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to dye my hair living coral. It's a lot like this shade, but a little more ombre. And once I dyed my hair, it was all clear to me. I'm gonna quit my stable job up in Ames. I'm gonna move out of my cute little Sherman Hill apartment that I love, and I'm gonna book a one-way ticket to Germany. I had an Airbnb lined up for 10 days in Germany, and then that was it. No idea where I was going or staying or what was next. I would go on to just travel from country to country, place to place. It was kind of my own version of Eat, Pray, Love. And gang, I ate. I prayed, and I loved a little. I would go on to visit 13 countries, taking a ferry to Finland, performing with street artists in Norway. I even got to see the Spice Girls live at Wembley Stadium in London. And I got my passport stolen in Barcelona. Gang, I don't know if you've ever been in Barcelona or in a foreign country where you don't speak the language, you don't have any forms of identification or any forms of payment, but it'll ground you pretty quickly. And in my case, I was also at SPF 100, which was kind of a big deal. After that, it was on to the motherland, the land of my ancestors, the one place I wish I could have taken my late Grandma O'Neill, Ireland. For 2 weeks, solo, on a road trip, on the other side of the car, on the other side of the road, I drove around and devoured the green scenery. I also visited as many Irish pubs as I could. And I did well, gang. I did well, thank you. In fact, I don't think I paid for a single Guinness the entire time I was there. Those travels were amazing, but there were a lot of tough times. I was truly alone, without family or friends, in foreign cities and countries where I didn't speak the language, grieving and going through something pretty traumatic. It was there that I struggled because I felt guilty, like should I be back home grieving like everyone else? Should I really be taking this much time for myself in this way? It was where I questioned everything and also tried to find all the answers. And then came Paris. And the hotel canceling on me and me, crying in the corner of the fancy cafe. Earlier that day, when I had arrived in Paris, I bookmarked an experience. So Airbnb is where you open up your home to host traveling guests. Airbnb experiences are like gardening classes or cooking classes, or in this case, a house concert. And in my moment of self-pity in the cafe, I thought, well, shit, I might as well listen to some music and maybe make some friends. So I messaged the host, Roger, and I said, hey, Raj, couple of questions. 1, is this show still going on? 2, can I come? And 3, do you happen to have any suggestions of a place to stay nearby? He did. His place. How convenient. Turns out Roger's apartment was 2 blocks from the cafe where I had taken my refuge. 15 minutes later, he met me at the gate. He got out and said, well, hey there, stranger. Sounds like you're having some trouble. And I laughed because I knew in that moment everything was gonna be okay, because that's totally something my dad would have said. Roger leads us through the gate, into the courtyard, and there it is, the vision I had waited 16 years to see, the Eiffel Tower. Roger had gone up ahead of me, only to realize I was way back, and he goes, oh my God, I know, right? What have you? What have you indeed, Raj? That first night in Paris, I actually got to see the Eiffel Tower change colors at midnight from my terrace in my new temporary home. You see, I was only supposed to be in Paris for 5 days at a fancy hotel, and I ended up staying for 12 in Roger's adorable apartment at about 1/3 of the price. It was in Roger's that I felt so incredibly safe, comfortable, and content that I longed for a place of home for my own. So I Googled homes for sale in Des Moines, Iowa, and the little blue bungalow that appeared on the screen is the home I now reside in today. You see, it was Paris that gave me the power and the permission to pause. I gave myself the permission to stop feeling guilty, like I was grieving in the wrong way, like I was running away from something or to something, or I wasn't right where I was supposed to be, because clearly I was right where I was supposed to be. Paris was what I call a dad moment. It's where it's raining all day and the sun's not supposed to come out, but it does. Or it's something as simple as I get like a really good parking spot downtown right at like 5 o'clock on Friday. It's amazing. Or since his passing, people and places have been placed on my path that just align. And who's to say the fact that my dad passed away in 2018, I traveled the world in 2019, and 3 months later when I returned home, everything shut down. Life is just too short. It was there that I realized that life is either or. It's not yes and. Actually, it is yes and, because yes, I was grieving, but I was also really, really grateful. And Paris taught me that the universe, it has your back. The more you believe that, the more you will see it. If you're constantly seeing signs and being called to things, I hope you're listening, and I hope you lean in. Of all the things I've embarked on and the many, many more adventures I plan to take through storytelling, writing, comedy, music, and of course travel, I plan on living my life on purpose, in living coral, of course. And in the words of my dad, the ones in his handwriting that I now have tattooed on my left arm, nothing ventured, nothing gained, no regrets. May you trust yourself enough to venture on to whatever voyage you feel called to next. Thank you.